These copycats, American or Western, that it's probably being counterfeited in China. And you can add cars to that list, forcing BMW and Daimler Chrysler to threaten lawsuits. On the Peter Navarro, CNBC contributor, University of California Irvine business professor and author of The Coming China Wars, and Stephen Mim, assistant professor of American history at the University of Georgia and author of A Nation of Counterfeiters. Peter, you've been warning us about this particular issue in China right here on this show for years. What do you believe the US can do to try to help stop this kind of stuff?
Probably nothing. That's the interesting part about this, Mandy. It's very, very difficult to crack down on counterfeiting within mainland China. And one of the reasons is that counterfeiting and piracy in China actually creates lots of jobs. It keeps inflation low, so the government tacitly supports it. So anytime a company goes to try to challenge a trademark infringement or a design infringement, it faces jurisdictional problems, it faces court delays, and it usually loses.
You know, you say, Peter, that they have been tacitly supporting it at the levels of government in China, and yet, you know, we have seen certain efforts, at least at the legal level, to try and crack down on counterfeiting and piracy. So perhaps there might be the will, but there just isn't the way. Implementation is the bottleneck.
I think it's a bit like the movie Casablanca. You have your public kind of crackdowns to show some kind of will to do it, but in reality, it's a wink and a nod. There's some estimates, Mandy, and this is a stunning figure, that up to 20% or more of the Chinese GDP is driven by counterfeit and pirate activity. And so if you tried to get rid of that overnight, it would cause a severe dislocation. The problem here, though, for the auto industry is that this is an industry that if counterfeiting goes on, the research and development expenses are such that if Chinese competitors don't have to worry about those, they can dramatically undercut foreign manufacturers and grab market share, as they are doing pretty much all over the world now. They are the biggest growth industry in terms of cars in the world right now. China is.
You know, Stephen, you've got a really interesting perspective. You've just written an article about why China isn't doing anything worse than the US, say, 150 years ago. So what do you think China can learn from the US experience? What could perhaps the US be doing to help China?
Well, the U.S. experience is one in which 150 years ago counterfeiting was rife, just the same way it is in China today. We pirated literary works the same way the Chinese pirate DVDs today. We pirated everything from French paper to English gin to European medicines. This was quite common. This was a huge part of our economy, just like it is with China today. Ultimately, I think the U.S. can put economic pressure the same way that under different issues, adulterated food, for example, Europe was successful in putting pressure on the United States in the 19th century, getting some kind of regulatory reform in motion and in play. There's some hope, I think. But one thing we have to understand, too, is that for the moment, they have very little economic incentive to prosecute something like piracy or counterfeiting until they have their own...
Stephen, you know, hang on, Stephen. I mean, I know you're a history guy, but I don't think history can teach us anything at all. I mean, it's 150 years ago, a little bit of, you know, whatever the U.S. was doing. This is the global factory floor of the world, where these rip-offs
Well, the United States is ultimately going to be the global factory floor of the world in the 20th century.
It's ultimately dangerous for the American consumer, for European consumers, for consumers in Latin America who are going to buy these cars. These cars will look exactly like a Mercedes-Benz or a Honda, but the guts of them are not legitimate, and they are very unsafe. The Chinese cars that are coming out now are consistently failing crash tests in Russia and in Europe and everywhere else.
Yes, and they're also endangering Chinese consumers.